Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Lisa Schwartz. Thank you so much for joining us. I am very excited about today's speaker and today's topic. It is our, Jane, you know I don't mean old friend when I say it is our old friend, and the original business partner with me in ITSM Academy, Jane Grohl. And Jane, it's 11 o'clock, so I want to pass it right over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and let's get started.
All right, thanks, Lisa. I'm so excited to be presenting today. As Lisa said, I am with Lisa, the original founders of ITSM Academy. I've since moved on, but you know the Academy is always in my heart. And today I'm particularly excited because many of you know I come from the ITSM community. Spent a long time as an ITIL ITSM instructor, speaker. And so today I feel like I'm bridging two of my favorite topics, particularly related to IT service management and now my new passion around site reliability engineering. So again, a little bit about me. Some of you on today's webinar may know me from my past or even from my present. I'm currently one of the co-founders and CEO of the DevOps Institute. We are a professional member association committed to advancing the humans of DevOps. And again, I'll tell you a little bit more about that. I am a former ITIL instructor before the Academy. I've known Lisa a really, really long time, even life before ITSM Academy. I'm a former IT Ops director, former help desk manager. I do a lot of speaking. I'm also the author of the Agile Service Management Guide. So if anybody has taken Certified Agile Service Manager, Certified Agile Process Owner, those are based on the guide as well. But enough about me. A little bit about DevOps Institute. You know, our mission is to really drive human transformation in the digital age. We know that with the increase in interest in things like DevOps or site reliability engineering or ITSM or automation as an enabler, sometimes humans aren't put on center stage. And so we're a professional member association. I'll tell you at the end a little bit more about membership, but our mission is to advance the human elements of DevOps. And I think this past year has really shown us how critical that is. So our members get a safe environment where they can interact, they can learn, they can grow, they can celebrate their professional achievements. It's all about connection. So again, at the end of today's session, I'll tell you a little bit more about becoming a member of DevOps Institute. So if we look at our agenda for today, we're going to focus really entirely on site reliability engineering. You may be hearing about SRE, it's certainly growing, but we're going to look at it as an ITSM framework and dispel perhaps some of the myths about what SRE is or isn't. I'll tell you a little bit about SRE principles, some of the practices that are associated with it, look at SRE in industry today, and then we'll sum it up and give you some opportunities to learn some more.
And Jane, we put together a little one polling question today just to help you get a feel for the audience and how familiar they are with SRE. So while we get that up, if you want to just keep on going.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, SRE is one of the, so while people are filling out the poll, I think SRE is one of those things that caught everybody by surprise. You know, it was born out of some books by Google. It was really never intended to kind of gain the traction that it has. It didn't grow up as part of DevOps. It actually grew up in parallel. So those of us who come from operations celebrate the fact that, you know, we would not be left behind in the DevOps transformation movement. So it's got a kind of interesting history in the sense of, you know, DevOps always stopped at deployment, and, you know, SRE, crosses that gate into operations, and you know, yay for people in operations, because we're the ones that, in Lisa's terms, make the magic happen every day by ensuring that systems are reliable and available. How's our poll going?
Let's look, shall we? Why don't we close that down and see what we got? So, oh, yes, thank you. So 73, this is great. 73% are not at all or only somewhat familiar with SRE and here to learn. You guys, we are going to check every one of those boxes for you. 10% are very familiar. SRE practices are being used in my company. And 4% are actually SRE certified. Nope. 4% are functionally SREs, and 6% are SRE Foundation certified. And 16% are interested in our SRE Foundation class. And guess what? At the end of the webinar, we're going to give you guys a 10% off code because we have a class coming up. All right, Jane, back to you.
Okay, awesome. If you would close that poll and our slides will come back up. Okay, so that's great because that really helps me understand where each of you are in your understanding and in your journey. But let's start today's story by looking at the last year. And I know some of you would prefer we don't look at the last year and we just pretend it didn't exist. But the last year, despite the fact, I mean, from a human global pandemic change, taught us a lot, particularly those of us in the technology space, right? We learned a lot about having to shift business requirements very, very, very quickly. And for many of us, you had no notice. I mean, we've talked about this for years, and then suddenly, we had to transform large heritage organizations to work from home. And truthfully, we don't know yet what the new normal looks like. Right, little by little by little, I think the term hybrid is starting to emerge, where we're talking about hybrid work environments, hybrid humans in terms of skills, and hybrid events. So I think this is probably going to start off as the decade of hybrid. But I also think that one thing became very clear last year, and that's that organizations that were not necessarily embracing digital transformation or really moving forward with it found out that digital transformation is no longer optional, right? Organizations that had a digital footprint of some type or another really survived, and in many cases thrived in the past year. There were some organizations that truthfully just didn't make it because they couldn't compete against those organizations that had amplified their digital footprint and were able to stay in business or to grow their business. But as we exit, and hopefully we're all exiting out of this terrible, terrible global crisis, organizations need to recognize that things have changed and we're no longer going to be the same. So digital transformation, however you or your organization define that, is no longer optional. And so if digital transformation is no longer optional, you can't be digital if you aren't reliable. And so, that's kind of the heartbeat of the growth of site reliability engineering, that we need to look at reliability, we need to look at availability, we need to look at capacity as being essential elements of a digital experience. Now, I have a long history in ITSM, and I remember in the old days, I'm an ITIL service manager from a long time ago, that availability management, capacity management, release management were those processes that were confusing, right? That weren't really mainstream processes, compared to, say, incident management or service level management, change management, and such. But when we start to look at site reliability engineering as an ITSM practice, we now need to bring capacity management, performance, and making sure that our services are both reliable and available, right, and have the appropriate amount. It's not the only part of it, but I want you to really think in that direction if that's not necessarily part of your core experience. So let's start this off with what is site reliability engineering and why has it gained the kind of traction that it's been gaining over the last couple of years. So a bunch of people from Google got together and wrote a book called Site Reliability Engineering, really describing how they run their very, very complex production systems, right? So you figure if Google can keep their systems reliable and available, then, what are they doing that, say, heritage organizations, I don't call them legacy, right? But organizations that have long histories, that have very, very complex environments, you know, if Google can do it, maybe you can too. And so they described a lot of the practices that they use and how they created this role called the site reliability engineer in their environment, which again spawned a whole bunch of other roles, but how they created this role of site reliability engineer and what that role did, right? What were the practices, processes, and principles associated with it? And how did this role or team interact with other roles and team? And it really became a bestseller pretty quickly. You can read the SRE book for free on the Google site. You could buy it from Amazon if you want. The follow-on book to the original Site Reliability Engineering book is the Site Reliability Workbook, which gives you more prescriptive guidance on how to execute some of these practices. And then more recently, a follow-on book about building not only reliable systems, but secure systems. And again, you can read all of these for free on the Google site or purchase them from Amazon. You may not be Google. And so I think that's important to kind of state that right up front. If you're looking at SRE and you go, wow, we're not Google, right? We don't have, you know, thousands of SRE roles, or, you know, our systems may not be as cloud-based or as modern or as even as complex as Google. But the core principles apply to everyone, because Google looked at you know, a digital landscape from an operations perspective. And as I said, while the polls were being introduced, that if you look at, say, practices like Agile or DevOps, you know, Agile was about development, DevOps was about preparing code for deployment, right, up to and just at the point of deployment. And then, you know, those of us that come from operations kind of went, well, now what? And I think site reliability engineering answers a lot about the now what. And again, you may be familiar with waiting at the other side of the wall for somebody to throw something over if you were in any kind of support role. It takes a lot of that away, right? It takes away I wonder what they're going to throw over the fence at us today, and, you know, we'll have to deal with users. You know, Ben Trainer Sloss really, I think, described it well. It's what happens when you ask a software engineer to design an operations function. Now, there is an engineering mentality that's baked into SRE, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be a developer or you need to be somebody that is really immersed in automation engineering. There's certainly a piece of that, but it's really developing an engineering mentality that when we start to engineer service management, when we start to engineer operations, we look at it from an architecture's point of view, and we look at it certainly from a flow point of view. By its own admission, Google considers SRE as its approach to service management. So today we're going to look at SRE as a service management framework, including some of the processes and practices that you may be very, very familiar with if you come from any type of an ITSM role or ITSM organization. But look at what the SRE team is responsible for. It's responsible for availability, latency, performance, efficiency, change management, monitoring, emergency response, incident management, and capacity planning of their service. There's a lot of ITSM baked into that. And then the rules are codified for how these teams will interact with their environment. Here's I think, really the golden part of it. Not only in production, but with the development teams, the testing teams, and the users. So the role of the site reliability engineer is responsible for a lot of the ITSM, all of the ITSM practices, but they also are engaged and interact with the development teams, the DevOps teams, the testing teams, and the users. So it's not just a wait at the other side of the wall for operations to receive whatever's being deployed. It's a very, very, very interactive role. it is the capstone element of a self-regulating software delivery system. So if you kind of look at the graduation of some of the practices that have emerged, let's say over the last 15 or 20 years, agile software development, starting with the Agile Manifesto and practices like Scrum, really helped to reshape software development teams, software development approaches by kind of breaking down the waterfall into these kind of sprint-based, incremental, iterative approaches to software development, right? Make things smaller and more frequent so that we can get them into production much more quickly. And then the emergence of DevOps about 11, 12 years ago, which started to look at what happened after the Scrum teams or the Agile teams sent code out and being able to accelerate the flow of the build and deploy processes by optimizing a lot of automation and starting to shift a lot of the responsibilities to the left, like security or testing. And then we got to deployment. And as I said before, DevOps would kind of celebrate continuous deployment, and then it would go into operations, but DevOps and Agile would start again, right? So they would start their next iteration, and those in operations were still waiting at the other side of the wall. And I think that's the gap that SRE fills. That SRE fills it from an operational perspective, and finally, really, exemplifies the fact that everything that IT does only shows value when it's in production, and the only way users really perceive value is if the service is available and usable by those that are going to consume it. The key here is each of these systems was designed to be self-regulating. So if you know anything about Agile encourages self-organization among the Agile teams. They're given tasks, they know what to do. They're not told how to do it. Same thing with DevOps. DevOps is a self-regulating, self-organizing approach where, again, the teams are encouraged to shift a lot of the responsibility earlier in the cycle, but they're not told what to do or how to do it. And SRE is a self-regulating system as well. So it is kind of the third piece of that develop, deploy, operate puzzle. It does align most closely with the goals of Agile and DevOps, so that we can deploy faster, we can deploy smaller, right? We can be more productive, and that the flow is constant, right? That there are less constraints in the software development lifecycle flow, or the flow of the value stream, right? There are less gateways, there are less milestones, but there are also consequences, right? So in a self-regulating system, you have to be able to manage and provide autonomy, but you also have to have oversight. So having said that, and I hope you're starting to, get some ideas about what I'm going to talk about, let's start with understanding what are the principles that sit behind SRE. Some of these will be very familiar from a service management perspective. Some may be new to you, so hopefully I'll be able to disseminate some of that. So the first set of guiding principles really look at SRE from a team perspective, right? So the team wraps themselves around achieving agreed service level objectives. Now we're going to look at service level management in a little bit, but SLOs from an SRE perspective are the center of the universe, right? The SLOs drive everything else. They drive change management, they drive problem management, it drives capacity management, it drives everything. And everybody understands what those SLOs are. So not everybody just in operations, where in service level management, maybe it's only the operation teams that are managing that, but the developers understand what the service level objectives are, the build and deploy teams, the testing teams, everybody understands what those SLOs are. And everybody understands that they have to be achieved for this service. All right, and again, it's negotiated in a very similar way. You notice it's not SLAs. And then if everybody understands what the SLOs are, then the team is allowed to regulate their own workload and self-organize, right? So they don't necessarily need to have, the type of approvals or the type of requirements that that may be traditional, they are allowed to self-organize. Now, they're working with other self-organizing teams, like the Agile Scrum teams or, the DevOps teams. So there's a lot of self-organization happening, but the team does have the ability, is empowered with the ability to regulate their own workload. The other thing about SRE that I'm particularly fascinated with is that an SRE is gold with only spending about 50% of their time doing reactive work, responding to incidents or responding to something that needs to happen. But they're gold with having 50% of their time to be proactive, where they can make tomorrow better than today. And what does that mean? It means that they're going to try to automate their way out of manual work. Right, looking at ways to increase the flow, most likely through automation. It may be through process, right? But they're given the time to be able to explore options, to be able to reduce what's known as toil, right? You know what toil is. Toil is that manual work that everybody dreads doing and just consumes an amazing amount of time. And so again, key principle is to be able to grant the SRE time to be able to do that. And then, like many other frameworks, we have to look at the ability to be continuously learning. And so failure is an opportunity to improve. Nobody wants to fail, but we have to look at failure. We have to look at incident management as learning opportunities so that we don't keep repeating the failures of the past. So these guiding principles are very much human-based, right? We understand the goals. We understand that we need to achieve those goals, so we're empowered to regulate our workload. We're given time to be able to improve the flow and the operation, so we can make tomorrow better than today. But we also understand that any failure has to be blameless, and it has to be used as an opportunity to improve. Now, if we kind of take those SREs down to more of the prescriptive side of it, SRE very much encourages the embracing of risk. Now, intelligent risk taking, of course, has to be the goal, but we also understand by deploying and operating in smaller increments that testing is done all the way along the pipelines, but we need to make sure that we do understand and we do embrace risk, but we're not going to threaten those service level objectives whenever possible, right? So as long as we can achieve those service level objectives, then the opportunity to take some risks, to be able to optimize automation, to be able to do a lot of different things is certainly there. Again, service level objectives drive everything. Want to be able to monitor distributed systems. I'm going to talk a little bit about event management in a minute and a couple of new approaches to how monitoring is occurring in many organizations. But service level objectives, in order to meet service level objectives, also mean we need to focus on eliminating toil. And as I said, DevOps Institute, my team has coined two terms. One is we want to get out of Toil Town and we want to move to Automation Nation, right? So you're welcome to adapt that. But again, you know what toil is. Toil is manual work that consumes amount of time, perhaps is a constraint to flow, right? So because it takes time and because it's manual, it may not be consistent. And it may also cause delays. And so being able to identify toil, by SRE's definition, it's anything you have to do twice manually, but being able to identify and take proactive steps to eliminate or at least reduce toil is very, very, very important. And you do that in large part through automation, right? Being able to write a batch script, being able to look at existing tools, being able to identify new tools, right? Being able to do that. So while we know that SREs are often equipped with, say, Python skills, it's that engineering mentality, I think, that really looks at automation in terms of how can we make this better. It doesn't mean you have to write your own tools, right? Again, it could be a batch script, it could be an existing application, but it's understanding that the one benefit to automation is it's usually consistent, right? It will repeat the process over and over and over again, and therefore remove the human from that so that the human can do what humans do best. You have to maintain an element of simplicity, even in very complex environments. And again, for those of us that come from a long history in ITSM, release management and release engineering has really emerged as a core competency, because if the release is successful, chances are good we'll be able to operate it better in production. So those are the core principles that have been built around SRE. Again, they're not necessarily magical, but they address the human side of the role of the site reliability engineer or the site reliability team, but it also addresses the principles around service management, right? Again, with keeping those SLOs in the middle. So now what I want to do is I want to show you why Google considers SRE its approach to service management, and why, despite all the technical things, some people I think in the ITSM community are concerned that SRE is too technical, right? Let's look at SRE as a service management framework, because that's what it is. And if you read the book, you start to see all of the ITSM practices and processes baked into it. So to my mind, it is the most innovative approach to ITSM since ITIL. Now, again, I was very fortunate to be involved in ITIL in the very early days, and I think ITIL laid the groundwork for a lot of what organizations did to transform, right? And so ITIL is still very relevant. This is not a comparison between ITIL and SRE, but I do think from an innovation perspective, Lisa and I really were at the early stages of the ITIL wave. I think from an innovation point of view, that SRE is probably the most innovative approach to service management since ITIL. And again, I think that just takes a look at service management from perhaps a slightly different lens, and looking at it from, okay, what are these core practices? Because regardless of whatever framework you're applying, the service management processes and practices are the same, right? You still have to manage incidents, changes, capacity, availability, and the like. So I really want you to think of it kind of as a third piece of the Agile DevOps operation puzzle. Some of these processes you're probably pretty familiar with if you have any experience with ITSM. These are the ones we're going to take a high-level look at from SRE's point of view. Again, I encourage you to go through SRE Foundation to learn more. And again, the books are available to you as well. But these are the key practices that most organizations have implemented related to ITIL or ITSM. A lot of the spirits are the same, some are different, but I really want you to see how SRE addresses them. So service level management, as I've said now multiple times, the heartbeat, the center of site reliability engineering are agreed service level objectives. Now, they're objectives. They're not agreements. They're not requirements. They're objectives. There's an objective. There's a series of objectives that are established for SLOs. In fact, a guy by the name of Alex Hidalgo just wrote a book on, he comes from Google, but he wrote a book, he's now with Noble 9, I think, on developing effective SLOs. So there's some really good guidance in terms of how you can come to your service level objectives, right? And the service level objectives are measured by what's known as service level indicators. So the service level indicators are the individual aspects of the service. Could be hardware, could be software, could be infrastructure, could be the cloud, it could be any of the environments that are associated with it. But by measuring the indicators will roll up to the health of the objectives, right? So you have to measure the objectives overall, but you do that with discrete measurements called service level indicators. one of the things that SRE addressed was the concept of the service level agreement. Service level agreements are awesome, but unfortunately, they've taken on a definition or a spirit that looks more at what happens when things break than actually achieving reliability and availability. So SRE avoids a lot about the agreement, the SLA, because there's a belief that the term is very overloaded. It's again, the recognition of what an SLA is very dispersed. And because it takes on so many different meanings depending on the context, you may sign on with a provider and they give you an SLA that they'll respond in 2 hours if there's an incident. Well, that's not an SLA, right? SLA would be, what's the availability? But we've come to associate that. So SRE avoids the agreement aspect or the legal aspect of it, and really looks at kind of meeting those objectives. And what it takes to meet those objectives also means eliminating toil, being able to manage discreetly to the service level indicators. Now, here's where things I think are fundamentally different, perhaps, from what you've experienced in the past. And that's the introduction of something known as an error budget. If we know what the service level objectives are, then there's an agreement that there is going to be a certain amount of errors that are going to be associated with that. Now, again, it's never 100%, right? This is really where you're looking at reliability. If reliability is associated with the service level objective, what amount of error is allowed or agreed to for this particular service? And again, there's a lot of different elements that are built into it, but essentially the team is given an error budget that says, if you stay within these constraints, right, you achieve the service level objectives and stay within your error budget, essentially you can change at will, right? The team can self-organize and agree on changes at will. Now, if the error budget is breached, there are consequences and policies that apply to everybody, including the developers. But as long as the team and the service stays within the confines of this error budget, the team is given a lot of autonomy to release. Now, there may be thresholds, right? Depending on the scope of the release, there may be other constraints that are associated with the error budget. But it allows the velocity of the release to increase, right? Because you're giving teams the accountability and the empowerment to be able to make changes without necessarily going through a change advisory board or going through any kind of decision authority. So essentially, what does this mean? It means that SRE is increasing the definition of standard changes, right? If you're familiar with ITSM, at its heart, the idea of a standard change is low risk, high volume types of changes. Well, the error budget essentially redefines standard changes, which means the team can release because the team is doing all of the right things to ensure that the service level objectives are being met. Automation is applied. Absolutely. The best way to increase your release velocity to ensure the health of the release is to be able to optimize automation for testing, for deployment, excuse me, for monitoring and whatever. In many ways, it removes humans from the decisions, right? It removes things like a change advisory board or a change control board. Now, again, there may be thresholds where based on levels of risk, we still need those entities. It's not necessarily getting rid of those entities, but it is increasing the definition of standard change, right? We want to be able to avoid the fact that those that are furthest away from the change may be making decisions and there may be delays associated with it, particularly if the change is small and frequent and the team feels that they're going to be able to meet their service level objective. So again, it is pushing empowerment and accountability down to the teams. And by the way, who's accountable for this? Not just the SRE, it's the development team, it's the deployment team, right? There's a holistic approach to error budgets and change management, because if the budget is breached, all future deployments are stopped until they figure out what went wrong, right? So again, policies and consequences drive this. Now, event management is emerging into a new set of practices that include monitoring, but you may be hearing a little bit about observability. And if you haven't heard about observability, I encourage you to learn a little bit more. Monitoring is essentially reactive, right? If the dashboard is green, we're all excited about that. The dashboard looks great. If it's amber, we start to look at what's happening, but it still is a reactive mode. And there still is very much a need to be able to understand latency, or what kind of traffic we're having, or what kind of errors we're seeing, excuse me, and what kind of saturation. Let me see if I can clear that frog. But observability is also looking at things from an external perspective, right? So we're looking at internally, we're looking at the infrastructure, we're looking at the application performance, but we're also observing its usage. We're observing it from an outside in type of perspective. And so I'm not totally familiar with control theory, but that's where observability really comes from, where you're observing your environment from both an internal component, say, level perspective, but you're also observing it from the outside in terms of experience, in terms of usability, in terms of throughput. So it really is kind of taking event management up to the next level. At DevOps Institute, we did a skill up day last year all about observability. And it was really fascinating listening to thought leaders really kind of explore the differences with observability. But in SRE, we are moving, even though observability didn't really grow out of SRE, it's becoming very, very closely aligned with it. Now, capacity management, as I said before, in my early days of ITSM, when you were standing up your service manager exam and all those great essays associated with it, capacity management, availability management, release management were just scary processes, right? Because, there was a lot of discussion about a capacity plan, but not necessarily accountability for who's going to be responsible for the capacity of a particular service, or developing a short-term and long-term approach to capacity. Well, the SRE team, or the SRE role, is responsible for capacity for that service. Now, there may not be a unique SRE team for a particular service. That team may spread across a couple of services, depending on the organization, but it's making sure that capacity is planned and provisioned as needed. You hear a lot now about elastic infrastructure, right? Particularly in the cloud. Well, capacity management now has more prescriptive guidance in the SRE books that talk about, okay, how do you plan for organic growth, right? Just that natural evolution. And what about event-driven capacity? Maybe there's a special sale, or it's a holiday, or it's benefits renewal, and there's going to be a lot more traffic. So it's really providing some pretty good guidance in terms of how to manage capacity, as opposed to, say, an annual capacity plan, where these days, like last year, if you think about capacity from last year, capacity suddenly became very critical when you had 10,000 people working from home and trying to dial into your VPN, right? So, whatever capacity plan you had developed probably, was tossed out. And really looking at how do you support that became pretty essential. Moving along, incident management. So there's a lot going on right now in the space around incident management. The good news is incident management is getting a lot of attention. There are initiatives like learning from failure, initiatives that have been stood up over social media, using these opportunities to understand kind of the state of the organization. Donna Knapp used to say, if you want to know what's going on in the organization, look at the incident logs, right? Because it really does tell you about how the organization is performing. In SRE, most of the guidance around incident management kind of falls into two camps. One of which is the role of the SRE is on call. And so what happens at 3 o'clock in the morning when the SRE is paged, there's a dated term, right? But is called. And how do they go through workarounds and what autonomy they have to be able to resolve incidents. The other is really looking at major incidents. And so in a major incident, SRE defines an incident commander who's going to be in charge, right? He's going to be in charge of that particular incident and is going to structure the response, look at responsibilities, remove impediments, and keep a living incident document. So there is an accountability that's assigned. It isn't a single incident commander for all incidents, right? It would be depending on the circumstances, but it does create a recognized command post and doesn't rely on escalation schemes where, you have 15 minutes to respond and they pass it around to a bunch of different people trying to figure out what's going on. This really creates the war room effect. And it's very structured, right? It's very, very structured. It's very clear. There's less of that management by running around. And they may just create a living incident document. It could be something in an ITSM tool that everyone has access to so that they can keep updating it. It may be a Google Doc, right? It doesn't clarify what the quote unquote ticket looks like. Whatever the Google Doc is may be entered as a ticket after the event is over, but it also addresses some of the on-call requirements and guidance, what to do when you're on call, and again, really equipping the role with some autonomy to fix things instead of having to do that 3 o'clock in the morning wake up to everyone else. So again, incident management is managed a little bit differently. It doesn't necessarily talk about help desks or service desks or ticketing systems or things like that. But the spirit is there. How you execute it and where you keep your document doesn't really matter. It's really just driving it from there. And along those same lines, when we look at problem management, SRE doesn't call it problem management. SRE calls it effective troubleshooting. It's really looking at, again, taking a scientific method to understanding root cause and how to cure it, right? It's almost a medical approach to it, where it's triaged, it's examined, it's diagnosed, it's tested to see if the treatment works, and ultimately cure. Just to focus on this, I think one of the things that's really have come out of Agile DevOps and now SRE is the concept of blameless postmortems, right? We have to stop following the pointed finger and start understanding that the contributing causes of the incident can't indict one person or a team. If it is human error, hey, everybody knows who it is. We don't need to shame that individual. We need to learn from it. Right? The assumption is everybody on your team is skilled, committed, loyal, and things happen. And so understanding what happened and how to cure it for the future is very, very important. So this blameless postmortem is without indictment, it's without shame, right? And everybody gets comfortable with that so that it becomes a safe environment for really understanding what went wrong. Even if an individual has to do a mea culpa, like, hey, I screwed up. There's no shame associated with it, right? There is a learning opportunity, and of course, a goal towards preventing similar things in the future. So those are the key ITSM practices that I wanted to address today. SRE really does also look at and provide very tangible guidance on security, particularly from an operations perspective, software engineering, emergency on-call, load balancing, communication and collaboration, the human side of this, and then also product launches and how to make them more reliable. So again, I encourage you to learn a lot more about SRE, take the SRE Foundation training through ITSM Academy, read the books. There's so much really good guidance in this that I think, regardless of where you are, if you're an ITIL organization, it still is adopt and adapt, right? So, there is no one perfect ITSM framework. And I think there's a lot of really good modern guidance here. So I have to address this before we go to questions. And so I think a lot of the concern about from the ITSM community is something like SRE is that, isn't it much more technical, right? Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm probably the least technical person in today's call. I'm, an IT director. I've led IT for a long time. I know just enough to be dangerous. I'm not a developer. I'm not a coder, right? You don't need to be the most technical person on the block. You do need to be somebody that's interested in learning. I figure if little kids can learn Python, I probably can too, right? It is a little bit more technical in the sense of we want to look at automation and not just ITSM tools that will help us track records. Really, it's looking at automation to take some of those skills so that humans can really be the drivers behind the strategies, behind the operations, instead of the ones actually performing the work. You need intelligent process for intelligent automation. And you need to look at service management as an engineering discipline, because processes have to be engineered as well. We are information technology, so we shouldn't be afraid or put off by practices that may appear to be more technical. If you're not technical, go find somebody on your team who is, who you can work with, right? Who you can learn from, who you can maybe get some of their time to help you write a batch script or help you overcome some of this, right? You don't need to be a full stack engineer in order to adopt some of these practices. And by the way, as a role, right, the role is so cool that if that's part of your aspirations, then you will develop more technical skills. So don't be put off by thinking that SRE is more technical. Therefore, if you're a change manager, this is not for you. It's not true. So let's talk about the rise of SRE, and then I'm going to open it up for some questions. We've seen at DevOps Institute, we do an annual report known as Upscaling. Actually, the 2021 report is releasing next week on the 21st. We've seen a tremendous rise in SRE adoption year over year. And this year, from the previews I've seen of the report, SRE is continuing to be adopted by organizations and transforming some of their systems administrator roles, some of their ITSM roles to SRE roles as well. The job of the SRE is the 5th fastest growing IT role for 2020, according to LinkedIn. And I think we're seeing that continue to grow and grow and grow. In fact, when we start to look at SRE, it's a real job. And again, 10,000 posted jobs in the US for SREs across most of these career sites, most of which are paying over $100,000 a year. So again, if you're in an operations type of role, then you may be headed to becoming a site reliability engineer. And certainly there are some intentional steps you can do to get there. Regardless, everybody in IT needs to understand SRE practices and principles as service management, right? As either part of your service management practice, part of your development practices, part of your operational practices. This is growing year over year, and I think everybody needs to pay attention.
Jane, there's a little fun fact I want to throw in there. So Robert Half, the staffing company, does an annual salary report, which my background coming originally from technical staffing, I've followed year over year. And SRE is one of the few, perhaps the only one that in last year's survey at they break it out into years of experience. And it is the only one that surpasses the manager at early levels of experience. So if you want to make more money than your manager, consider becoming an SRE.
Absolutely. The role is so in demand, and the requirements for the role, right, are evolving. But yes, this is it's such an in-demand role that and it's only going to grow, right? It's only going to grow. And again, from an operations perspective, those of us in operations who heard the term no ops, right, for years and years and years, now kind of are chuckling a little bit as SRE is outpacing some of these other roles in terms of talent demand. So That's cool. Anyhow, if you want to, I only gave you a taste, right? I could only give you today a taste of what SRE is all about from a service management perspective. But if you want to learn more, ITSM Academy is a valued elite partner of DevOps Institute. We're working together on SRE Foundation. So Lisa, do you want to share a special announcement?
I do. Thank you, Jane Girl. So and I wanted to ask, are you going to name that frog? When you said frog,
I know.
I had to laugh because I just thought it. So we are running our next SRE Foundation class, June, of course I had it, now it's gone, June 22 through 25, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern time, and I will put this in chat. And for those of you that are on the webinar today, we are offering a 10% off code for you, and that code is SRE Web. And again, I will put that in chat, and it will be in the follow-up email that you guys receive.
I hope you go through this. We have seen, again, with the growth of SRE, organizations that are, like we've seen in the past with other disciplines, really equipping the masses so that everybody understands the practices, the principles, some of the new techniques that are associated. This is not a technical, right? This is not learning Python. It is really understanding SRE from a broad view, right? So if you're a developer, you're an ITSM person, you're in operations, it is really foundational information that it's important to everyone. Okay, before I take questions, I do want to encourage you to become a member of DevOps Institute. We recently introduced a premium level that has some premium benefits to it, including access to our ADOC assessment from a team perspective, which is the assessment of DevOps capabilities. Really, really important opportunity to look at your team. So for $199 a year, you get a lot of benefits that are associated with it. Of course, our basic membership is still available, as well as our enterprise membership. Communities are evolving, and we're really proud that over the last 6 years, we have been able to grow the DevOps community as DevOps has evolved, and now with SRE as well. So go up to our website, become a member, whether it's basic, whether it's premium. Of course, we welcome enterprises as well. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you. And Lisa, I'm hoping we have a few questions.
We have a couple of great questions and one that is a bit of a doozy. But before we go there, I'm going to ask my questions. I remember in the 2019 and the 2020 Upscaling Report, there were, and you referenced that a little bit toward the end of the presentation, but I remember that a lot of the teams that were surveyed were using all three. And by all three, I mean DevOps and ITIL. Do you know, I know it hasn't been published yet, but do you know if that trend continues in the 2021 Upskilling Report?
So I think that in 2021, we're going to see, I can't give you the full preview. I think organizations think they have to choose one or the other. And the reality is they don't. I mean, Google's spoken about it, that, this is not meant to compete. It's not meant to whatever. The rise in SRE from an enterprise adoption. So 2021, we had almost 2,100 respondents to the Upskilling Report, most of which were organizations of over 500, in many cases over 1,000 employees, right? And so while it didn't necessarily call out ITIL versus SRE or ITIL and SRE, even in the past, we have seen organizations that very much are, is that one of my cats? It is. That are very much looking to figure out how to embed multiple frameworks, right? So ITIL's there, SRE is there. The rise of SRE, I think, when you kind of look at the data from the report, you see like Agile and DevOps, have certainly continued to grow, but perhaps not at the same pace as SRE. And that's because they've had longer to mature, right? Same thing with
Right.
ITIL. ITIL has had longer to mature, even with the introduction of ITIL 4, right? So SRE being new, right, and starting to look at this adaptation to, you know, the growth of Agile, the growth of DevOps, I think is, you know, kind of new shiny thing. But it also helps operations. You know, ITIL crosses over into everything, where I think SRE is so operationally focused, and DevOps kind of stops at operations. So I think that's kind of the fascination.
That is, I gotta say, this is a little bit exciting because Rich just chatted in a question from our website chat, which has never happened before. So,
Cool.
Rich, I'm going to ask your question in 1 second, and I'm just to follow up with what Jane was just saying. You know, Jane Grohl, that drives me insane. It is not a question of which one should I be using. It is a question of, you know, really focusing on what should you pull from each to develop your high performing teams that are going to, you know, enable and accelerate your company's digital strategy. You know, I feel like if that's that might be the most had conversation that I've had in the last 17 years, is you going back all the way to our ITIL, you know, wasn't called V2 back then, but it was, should I be using ITIL or MOF? What, you know, one or the other? No, you should be looking at the capabilities. You know, my song and dance on that. So,
well, let me throw one more thing out, Lise, because it is important for everybody to understand this. And you know, I'm going to say something very controversial, which is no framework is perfect. There is no perfect framework, right? There is no framework that's going to address all of your issues, that's going to solve all of your problems, right? None. SRE is not perfect, ITIL is not perfect, Agile is not perfect, DevOps is not perfect, right? There is no one solution, right, that is going to solve all of your problems. And so we kind of have to stop taking kind of a religious point of view when we look at some of these frameworks.
Amen.
Like I'm being disloyal if I look at another framework, or I'm cheating if I look at another framework. There is not a single IT framework out there that's perfect. And so, or that is so all-encompassing that it is going to solve all of your problems.
Mm-hmm.
So the great news is we are encouraged to look at everything and then build a framework that works for you, right? And it may be a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of that, and that's okay, right? That's okay. You're not cheating. You're not disloyal if you start to open up and look at other things. And also, by the way, you're not losing your investment. You know, some will say, well, I invested so much in, you know, waterfall. You're not losing your investment. You're building.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Anyhow, getting off my soapbox.
Well, I was standing right there with you, sis. You know it. So, Rich's question is, where do the SREs typically reside in an organization? We have an infrastructure group under one manager, and I manage the SM platform, service desk, and desktop services.
So that's a great question. Really, it's a great question. So in a perfect world, and remember, there is no perfect, but in a perfect world, SREs are in the product teams, in the Scrum teams, in the service teams, right? So they are right there up front, you know, from the first line of code that's being developed about a product. Clearly, the ratio of developers to SREs is not necessarily 1-to-1. So you don't necessarily have one SRE team for every service, or one SRE in every single Scrum team or Agile team or product team, right? The ratios aren't quite there. Most of the time, the SRE teams are in either operations, could be network operations, could be service operations, right? Or systems administration operations, right? But they are
I just lost Jane. Is it me? Someone please chat it.
Well.
Oh boy. Well, you know what? She's in her RV. Here's a little Jane Girl fun fact. She and her husband have just sold their house that she, you know, has lived in for a very long time, raised her children in, etc. Jane, we lost you there for a minute. So I was telling people that you're over in your temporary
Oh, in
home
my
in your
RV.
RV.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, I
We
know.
can.
I live in
Yes,
my
ma'am.
RV. Yeah. What I was saying is the ratio is not always 1-to-1, right? Where you have, one SRE for every Scrum team or one SRE team for, every product team. As close as possible, they are embedded in the teams so that their familiarity with the service is really, I'll use the word intimate, right? That they're really in it and they're not waiting on the sidelines. But because they cross over from pre-production to production, my hope would be that their relationship with support, because they serve the role of second or third line support. So if you have level 1, level 2, or level 3, those may be individuals that are really ripe to growing into the SRE role so that they can cross back over into development. But hopefully their relationship with first line support is very strong. But they're embedded, right? They're part of the teams. They're not a side dish.
So Jane, we still have several more really good questions. My favorite one is the one that I'm going to ask next, but we are at the hour. So for those of you that have to go, remember we'll load up the presentation itself, but also the Q&A onto our YouTube channel. So if you have to drop off, you will have an opportunity to hear Jane's thoughts on the rest of these questions. On your way out of the webinar, you're going to see a question that we ask of you. What topics would you like for us to cover? Please know that is actually how we build our webinar schedule. And we love to hear your ideas and thoughts. And side note, we know you all love to hear from practitioners. You are practitioners. Reach out to us. We would be very happy to help you co-create a presentation about where you guys are in any piece of service management. And then it's something that you guys can then go to submit to speak at conferences. Because guess what? We are going to get to start going to conferences again next year. I know it. So, Donna and I are always very happy to help you guys with that. We love to have our practitioners speak. So, feel free. We'll help you, and we'll help you make it very successful. All right. So, Jane, here's my question, and I'm just really can't wait. I can't wait to hear your answer. So I'm trying to get approval to train my team on SRE, but our CIO, who comes from an ops background, not a development background, seems to have a little issue with SRE because this concept that, it's operations being governed by the developer or the dev team instead of the operations team. How can I overcome that? Isn't that a great question?
Yes. So our mutual friend Alan Schimmel talks a lot, and there's a lot of articles written about the democratization of IT, right? So where IT, used to be driven only from the top, now the influence is more broad-based. And so if I understand it correctly, the concern is that all of this is being pushed down to the developer. So why do we need to train operations? Is that kind of the spirit of the question, Lise?
It is, yep.
Yeah. So again, one of the reasons I think SRE has gained the kind of traction that it has is that, yes, a lot of responsibility is being pushed down to the developer, right? You hear the term full stack engineer or full stack developer, right? Which means they could do it. They could do it all. Well, we still support the fact that, a developer's core competency is development, and their broad level of competency is infrastructure, operations, testing, security, and all of the rest. But operations is still very much a discipline, and that's why SRE is starting to really gain the interest of these organizations, because developers can't do it all. They could do just enough, right? They could do just enough testing. They could do just enough security, right? But you still have security professionals. You still have operations professionals. And if operations becomes an enabler of flow, right? Or enabler, and reliability becomes the heartbeat of the service, right? Why have a service if it's not reliable, right? Developers aren't necessarily keeping it reliable because they're on to the next aspect of development, right? So if we don't put reliability into the value, into the top of the value chain, right, where it's the only thing that counts, right? Why have a service if you can't use it, all right? And operations runs that. The infrastructure teams, the post-production support teams, the application support teams. These are all folks that need to understand site reliability engineering, because as the name implies, it is all about engineering for reliability, right? Forget the fancy term. It's about engineering for reliability, and that's not going to be a developer's responsibility. Developers will observe, right? They'll adopt observability practices, they'll adopt security practices, but they're never going to be what I'll officially call full stack operations. That's not really a term, I made it up, but I still think it's an appropriate term, that we need to think of full stack engineers, full stack developers, and start to think about full stack operations.
Yeah. So Bert is asking, have you seen any use case studies, Agile plus DevOps plus SRE? And I know not a use case study necessarily, but obviously the Upskilling report does address it, and DevOps Institute will be sharing that out heavily, as will ITSM Academy and many others. But Jane, do you have any favorite use cases, white papers?
I do. Well, and I can give you a preview, but I can't tell you the details yet. So one of the first large enterprises, financial institutions that started their SRE journey, also not, again, I won't tell you much about it, but in any event, they have come to DevOps Institute and volunteered a case study. And so that case study is being developed right now.
Awesome.
Is that awesome, right? And they came to us. And so they did train a very, very large community on SRE Foundation. They actually, and here's another preview for you that you may not even know, Miss Lisa, a SRE practitioner certification is in development as well, because they trained a whole bunch of folks and they wanted a second level. And so they came to us and said, you know what, this has been so helpful for us. We would like to offer you the opportunity to do a case study. So there is use case coming from a large, complex organization, and we'll be able to see that. Clearly, organizations that are not as heritage are, you know, have Agile, DevOps, and SRE really growing. A woman I met a few years ago who used to work for Starbucks called SRE Starbucks Reliability Engineering. Mm-hmm. So clearly you start to see more and more organizations. Ironically, in the financial space, we're seeing more enterprise interest in SRE from, again, large, complex organizations. So stay tuned. There is a case study that's in development, and there also is a second SRE certification. And of course, ITSM Academy will be, will be right there at the forefront of being able to deliver that.
Mm-hmm. And Keith just chimed in. He's also seeing service reliability engineering. Love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, you know, the key is the R and the E, right? It's engineering for reliability. You're not Google, right? I don't think anybody, you know, listening, unless you're from Google, right, really has that kind of an environment. And that's okay. Don't be off put by that. The practices and the principles are applicable, I think, in medium organizations, large organizations, because it's really taking it down to the basics.
Yeah, and I love that in, you know, ITIL 4, high velocity IT, SRE's got a pretty nice, it's at least recognized in there. So, you know, I love to see that going back to the original, it's not one or the other, but, you know, building forward with a plan that makes it all work together. Mike, it looks like Mike B is still with us. I think that Jane has answered your question about where the role is positioned, but if you have a follow-on question to that, go ahead and chat that in for me, please. This is just an interesting comment. I really understood DevOps more as a result of attending your SRE Foundation class.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't really
awesome.
Thought that through. So this one's pretty tactical. So error budgets should also be associated with risk posture, question mark, going really back into subject matter there.
Of course. I mean, think about it. And again, you know, kind of driving what drove this SRE practitioner approach is to get more detail into how to build SLOs, how to build an error budget, right? Things like that. But yeah, when you're looking at, when a team has the ability to look at risk and also to be able to make changes, right, within this budget, of course, nobody wants to breach, right? Nobody wants to breach. The consequences are pretty significant. I mean, development stops if the error budget is breached. So it isn't just like you get slapped on the hand and you go to a blameless postmortem. You know, SRE says, you know, future releases are stopped until the team figures out what went wrong. And so it is a very collaborative approach with development. So there has to be risk profiling that's associated with that. And also, I think, thresholds. You know, it doesn't necessarily eliminate some of the decisioning that may be where the risk is higher, right? So if you're rolling something out to the entire organization and the risk is known, or there is more engagement from the business or otherwise, I think, you know, the original purpose of the CAB was an advisory board, right? Not an approval board. And so there needs to be a higher level of risk, or at least a threshold
Right.
for that. But I think everybody needs to kind of develop a risk mentality. Remember, one of the principles is embrace risk, but it doesn't mean embrace risk carelessly. It means intelligent risk taking.
Right. Right, exactly. So we are almost at the end of our questions. If anyone's got one more, I'll shoot it into me and I'll get it asked. And then I just wanted to say that, Jane, when your audio was gone there for a second, I jumped in and I said, is it just me? Did I lose Jane? Someone chat in and let me know. And everyone started chatting in, and Tim said she is lost. And that made
I am
me laugh.
lost. I am lost in the woods of Fort Myers. But I apologize for that. I didn't know it. I kept talking. So, you know,
Imagine that.
the cat and I had a really great conversation about SRE. He's ready to sign up for the class. He's a little skitsy, but you know, there you go. So anyhow,
Perfect.
Thank you. I mean, really, thanks, Lisa. You know, I always say this, you know, ITSM Academy is always in my heart, and being able to present this today to whom I'm assuming is perhaps a bunch of friends and others, you know, it really is a special time for me.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people on this call who you know and have known for a long time, and they are all sending in many, many compliments. So, but no more actual questions. So I think that's going to wrap us up for today, y'all. And
all right. Well, thank you.
All right, my excuse is that I got my vaccine yesterday. Nina, what is our May webinar? Oh, she's probably. I know we've got a great topic for May. It is the third Thursday at 11 a.m. as it always is. Again, you guys will be getting the promo code for the 10% off, which is only being offered. I sound like a Ginsu knife salesperson. Really, we are only offering that to those of you who attended the webinar today. And did that give you enough time to find it, Miss Nina?
I am.
Sorry about that, guys. I normally have that pulled up, but I think I'm a little scattered today because I was just too excited about getting my vaccine yesterday, and my arm hurts a little bit. But besides that, I'm doing well. Well, we'll send
like
it and follow
punched with a bat, right?
Exactly.
That's what everybody says. Yeah.
Like one of your cats got at me. So Jane, as always, just, you know, I love spending time with you, lady. Always have, always will. I really enjoyed today's presentation. I love when I can learn from you, and I did that in spades today. So thank you guys again for being here, and we look forward to having you come to some great topic in May.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.